and welcome to session 3 of the event. And if it is anything like yesterday, I think you're in for quite a treat, particularly with the distinguished panel we have got today. Let me start by doing the usual domestics, where I get to pretend to be an aircraft hostess. If there is a fire, which I'm not planning on, the exits are to the right and the left. If you require to use toilet facilities, they're right at the very back of the building. Could I also ask you to make sure that your phones are off or at least silent? I am aware that the sound, there is a bit of echo at times, so if you bear with us and have some sympathy for the speakers as well, that would be very helpful. Yesterday, when I was introducing the panel on philosophers, I introduced them as a symposium of philosophers. And I was wondering what the collective term would be for economists. I once held, I have to say rather cruelly, economists called a confusion of economists, but I'm sure we're not going to be in for any confusion today, but merely enlightenment, as is appropriate for this celebration of the tercentenary of the birth of Adam Smith. We have a change of chair this morning, and I'm delighted to hand over now to the chair, Dr. Robbie Mochrie.
Well, good morning. It's wonderful to be here in Kirkcaldy and to be celebrating the birth of Adam Smith. This is, in fact, speaking to one of our, to Graeme Roy, who I'll introduce shortly just beforehand, he was pointing out, of course, that in 3 years' time, in 2026, we'll be also celebrating the 250th anniversary of the publication of The Wealth of Nations. So this is the beginning of a multi-year celebration, hopefully, rather than the end of a birthday party. We have 4 very distinguished speakers today, and I have asked them all, when they come to the lectern, just to speak for a few minutes to introduce ideas. Roger has said this is a symposium. I would very much take it as being an occasion not when you will be told what to believe, but when you will have plenty of opportunity to ask questions. We're going to be exploring many of the ideas of Smith's economic thought, which as the several meetings I have been at already this week have confirmed, was very wide-ranging, very complex, very deep, and very challenging for us even today. So to just simply to introduce very quickly who will be speaking today, Sheila Dow of the University of Stirling in Scotland and the University of Victoria in British Columbia, who is an expert on a whole range of fields. I have just listed money, macro, economic method, and ethics. And Sheila will be talking about behavior in Adam Smith. And then we're going to have Bob McMaster, who I have discovered as I've come here is well known to many of the audience. Bob is a professor of political economy at Glasgow, and of course economics emerged from political economy at the end of the 19th century, so we might think of Bob perhaps as being a little bit of a throwback. He has been the editor of the Review of Social Economy, and Bob is going to be talking about care. Then we have Maria Pia Paganelli, who is at Trinity University in Texas. Maria is, I think, the most specialist of the Smith scholars on the panel today. She is the president of the Adam Smith International Society, and she has just come back from Chile, so which was a 2-day journey by plane with a break in New York, but she promises us an excellent paper on cronyism, which has to do with the nature of capitalism at the time Smith was writing. And then finally, we have Graeme Roy, one of the again, an extremely eminent economist. He has been head of department at Strathclyde. He has been, was the director of the Fraser of Allender Institute. He worked for the Scottish Government for many years. And at the moment, he is Dean of External Engagement at the University of Glasgow. Essentially, this is Graeme's show. And Graeme is going to be talking to us about how Smith appears in Hansard. So for any former MPs who are in the room, this may be the most uncomfortable part of the discussion. So I think that's enough for us to get on with. I'm going to invite Sheila to come up and start the proceedings.
Oh, thank you very much, Robbie. I really appreciate being asked to take part in this occasion. I mean, what a wonderful venue. Isn't this amazing? It's my first time in the Old Kirk. The topic I thought I'd speak about just for a short time is Adam Smith and behavioural economics. For a long time, most economists knew Adam Smith as the author of The Wealth of Nations. But in the last 20 years or so, there's been a lot more attention to his more philosophical work, the theory of moral sentiments. And a lot of this is thanks to behavioral economists. This is a new way of approaching economics that's become quite influential. And their focus is on actual behavior. Well, you'd think that that's what economists would study, wouldn't they? But the sort of counterpoint is that for a long time, the dominant way of thinking about the individual was as an isolated, selfish, economic agent who had full knowledge and acted rationally and calculated rationally in their own self-interest. But particularly with the growth of what's called experimental economics, in other words, getting people into a room and asking them, in a very sophisticated way, a series of questions, it was evident, and in a way that could be demonstrated scientifically, in a way, that people don't behave like that people don't have full knowledge, don't calculate rationally, in their own self-interest all the time, or particularly in a selfish way all the time. So economists started drawing on psychology to try and understand why people were behaving differently from rational economic man. And noted that a lot of what they were finding was there in the theory of moral sentiments. I mean, things like what's called loss aversion, caring much more about losing relative to winning the same amount. Being overconfident, unreasonably confident. Being unselfish. These are things that became obvious from the experiments, and which you could argue are just obvious from our own personal experience. And all this conflicted with the standard view of rationality. But in a way that this just provides a list of things, it implies that the theory of moral sentiments was just a list of observations about how people behave. Whereas in fact, Smith, along with David Hume, developed a theory of human nature. Their starting point was that the world that we study is complex, evolving, organic, and there's no way we can have complete information about it, or complete knowledge, in other words, understanding about what's going on. So that's a very different starting point. And he also, both of them, both Smith and Hume, also took as a starting point the fact that humans are social beings and take a sort of moral standpoint in their decision making. In other words, the starting point for decision making is what they call the passions, moral sentiments. also that individuals behaved prudently. They behaved in a way which reflected the rights and duties of the individual within society. And that individuals cared about justice, about fairness, and also about being benevolent. And in order to pursue these sentiments, humans have a range of faculties, and this is how we cope with the fact that our knowledge is uncertain. We have imagination, and this is what allows us to, strive for wealth, perhaps, because we imagine that it's going to make us happy. Smith suggested this is a delusion, but never mind, it's quite handy that people do that. And we can also imagine what the experience of other people is like. One of his important ideas was the impartial spectator, the idea that we have in the back of our minds when we make choices that there's this sort of mythical conscience on our shoulders, which is judging how we're behaving. And we have this reference point, which is the product of the imagination, and this governs our behavior. And there's reason in the mix there somewhere. I mean, we have the faculty of reason, but it's not something that comes first or is separable from the sentiments. It's very much interconnected with them. And this was very much, particularly Hume's argument against Descartes, that reason is not sufficient. We need all these other faculties in order to function as human beings. So we have there a system. Adam Smith was a man of system. He liked to try and put everything within a framework. And within conventional economics, there has also been a compulsion to put what the behavioral economists were finding out into a system. And the way they did it was to suggest that these results in experiments are the result of two possibilities. One is the result of the fact that we're cognitively limited. We're not very good at reasoning. It's a human failing, basically. Or that we have biases, the things that distort our understanding of our self-interest. So it's something that, you keep the rational economic man as your reference point, but somehow we fall short. And of course, the policy implication is one that several governments have picked up, which is to have policies to nudge people into being more rational. We should be saving more for our pensions, we should stop smoking, all these things. But the other possibility is that we've been rational all along. In other words, take something like trust, which is, something that Smith would be able to explain very well within his framework. The argument is rather that trust is rational. We only trust each other because it serves our self-interest. We give gifts because other people will give us gifts. So we're just back to the same framework, just with a little amendment. And another idea is that we respond to situations with intuition, and that's actually rational. It's just our minds being very quick, and we make decisions very quickly and intuitively, which turn out to be rational. It's kind of different from the thinking fast and slow argument, which you may have come across by Kahneman, but it's basically back to rationality again, which is so different from Smith's framework. And it just demonstrates how much richer Smith's arguments are, how much richer his system is for explaining how the world is the way it is. And there's so much scope for taking that further. And I mean, rather than experiments in a lab in a university, Smith's experiments were history. he read widely. He took examples from all periods and locations in order to draw out what he saw as the main features of the socio-economic system. So a lot's changed since Smith. I mean, it's 300 years. So there's so much scope. Some of it was being discussed in Glasgow yesterday for taking account of the way the world has changed and trying to work out how that influences behavior. So my conclusion is behavioral economists, keep on looking at Adam Smith. There's so much more you could get out of it. Thank you.
It's a fantastic pleasure. Thank you for your introduction, Robbie. Calling me a throwback, that's brilliant. It's a fantastic privilege and a real pleasure to be here in Kirkcaldy, the real home of Adam Smith. I want to make some provocative claims, perhaps to the annoyance of the Economics Academy. I, for one, don't think Adam Smith was the father of economics. I think he was the father of political economy, which is rather different, much richer. People might say I'm just saying that because I'm a failed economist. That may well be true. But nonetheless, I think there's a substantial amount of scholarship that would substantiate my claim. I want more specifically to argue that Smith said a lot about care, much more about care than he did the invisible hand. Yet the invisible hand has captured the imagination of economists to the detriment, I think, of care and the configuration of our economy. It's that fundamental, I think, that could be argued. The starting point really is that Smith, like classical political economists, argued that the economy was really about social provisioning. And that's really a term that emphasizes our interdependence as individuals and how we organize our society in order to try and address our needs, our wants, and how we socially reproduce, how we reproduce our society. And a central feature of that is care. And we have to look to a group of feminist economists who emphasize this notion of social provisioning and care. It's not in Keynes to nearly the same extent, and I'm a great admirer of Keynes as I am of Smith, but Smith really set the ball rolling on this. Now, care is very difficult to describe, to define. Roger demonstrated it earlier in terms of fulfilling a duty of care when he was doing his air hostess bit, as he put it earlier. That was fulfilling a duty of care. Care is being attentive, it's listening, it's recognizing someone's needs for care, their desires for care, responding to them, assuming the responsibility, and then actually delivering on care. Now, Smith was rather vague in this, and what Smith argued essentially is that care is bound up with affection, benevolence, kindness, and so forth. And he talked about concentric rings of care. Sometimes this is conflated as Professor McCloskey was arguing the other day with love. So care and love are hand in glove, as it were. I would go further than that because I think there's a very important parable in Smith, and I say this when I'm teaching Smith to the students. I think it's a wonderful tale, a wonderful parable. And Smith talks about the contrast of an individual, had to be a man, of course, a European man, on the prospect of losing a finger vis-a-vis an earthquake that could potentially kill millions in China, far off China. Now, obviously, we're dealing with the 18th century, so that was a considerable distance in those days. So Smith argues in this parable, this thought experiment, that this European male can quite comfortably go to sleep in his bed. He talks about the individual snoring, for instance, and he argues that this is morally justifiable despite the fact that millions of people have died in China, because this individual cannot do anything about it. And he contrasts that with the same individual who has the prospect of losing a finger the next day for whatever reason. And this individual, he said, would be justified, morally justified, for not being able to sleep because of the consequences to this individual of losing the finger. It's a much bigger deal for that person. Now, Smith argues that this is morally justifiable because there's little the individual can do to prevent the earthquake. But then he argues, what if the loss of this individual's finger could somehow prevent the loss of life in China? What would the individual do? So it's a big deal to lose one of your fingers, but if it stops somehow some disastrous event, the sense of loss for the individual could prevent the harm to other individuals that this person does not know. What would they do? Now, from a standard economics perspective, their understanding of Smith, they would argue about preferences, and they would say that the individual would weigh up what would happen to their own well-being and satisfaction and so forth. That's not in Smith. Smith argues that from the perspective of self-love, in other words, what is acceptable in society from this socialized individual, that the person would willingly lose their digit to prevent harm to others, even distant others that they do not know. That is care. That is care under Smith. And it demonstrates that we all have a duty of care in Smith. We have an assumption of responsibility. And if we can, we would exercise it. And it's not necessarily because of the regard immediately for others, but it's under Smith's understanding, this notion of self-love. How can we love ourselves? How can we approve of our own actions? And this is where Sheila's reference to the impartial spectator in Smith is of particular relevance. So what's the message of this for us today in economics? Well, in terms of how we assess and value care, it's obvious that care is marginalized in society because we can't put a monetized figure on it. And also how economists configure caring and the provision of care as a morally equivalent service, good to, say, producing CDs, I'm going back in time, cheese, anything. There's a degree of moral equivalence to whatever is produced in society. That's not Smith. That's not Smith. And I think we've lost this, unfortunately, in society, especially Western societies that are dominated by standard economics, I'm afraid. And I think it's beholden on us as academics, really, to interpret Smith not according to the Chicago School of Economics, which would talk about the selfishness and completely eliminate this notion of other regarding and care, or care is only extending to the selfishness. That's not in Smith. That's not in Smith. Smith talked about self-love and this balance between your regard and your duty for others as well as yourself. And I think if economics, it would involve quite a transformation in the academy, it has to be said, but if economics, as Sheila was alluding to with behavioral economics, if economics is serious about Smith, the so-called father of the subject, they should recognize this. I'll stop there if that's enough time, Robbie. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's a great pleasure. I will talk more about Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, his most famous book for economics. And I would like to start with the definition that Smith gives of the wealth of nations, the way in which he describes it. And he tells us that the wealth of nations is a very violent attack that I made upon the whole commercial system of Great Britain. So what does it mean that the wealth of nations is a violent attack against the commercial system of Britain? The way in which I suggest to read this is that is an attack against the merchants, and is also a way to say that there is no trade-off between efficiency and justice. So the attack against the merchants, as Smith offers to us, is an attack not just against inefficiency, but is also an attack against injustice. So that there is overlap between what is inefficient and what is unjust. And therefore, what is efficient is also just, or what is just is efficient. The merchants the Smith attacks are attacked because, according to Smith, they are able to capture the state and they are able to achieve very violent policies to benefit themselves at the expense of others. And that is a problem. You can benefit yourself, which is fine, but not at the expense of others. And in particular, Smith says that they're using the blood and treasure or their fellow citizens under the false pretense of enriching the country. This blood and treasure is, those are Smith's words, are literally so, meaning that Smith sees blood money in merchants' money. Why is that the case? For Smith, merchants are few and concentrated in cities, so it's very easy for them to cartelize. Majority of the people in his time are living in the countryside, so it's very difficult to cartelize. And it's very easy for the cartel to spread the cost among the population. The problem Smith identifies is that the interest of the merchants goes against the interest of society, because the merchants care about high prices and decreased competition. That by itself wouldn't be a big problem. The problem is that merchants are willing and able to disguise their interest as the interest of society. And they're doing it by playing on the ignorance of the population and of the sovereign. Again, that by itself shouldn't be too much of a problem. But if you combine the fact that their interest goes against society and they are able to convince the legislator that their interest is the same of the interest of society, what they're going to do is they're going to promote legislation and regulations that are going to affect the entire society, benefit themselves at the expense of others. So Smith tells us that the merchants conspire against the public to get their monopoly protections via force, offense, and intimidations. They're so powerful a lobby that they're able to create the entire British Empire to benefit themselves. So Smith attacks the apparatus of the British Empire as being a creation of special interest groups. Why is this a problem for Smith? Because, again, this is done through blood money. It's done through blood money because the empire is built through wars. And that is literally blood. The merchants and manufacturers are able to transform the natural friends that is your trading partner into enemies. And they're able to convince you that you should fight against them to protect their privileges at the expense of everybody else, especially the people who died. The other reason is that they're able to convince you that you should pay higher prices for the goods that you buy because it's good for you. Well, instead, it's not necessarily good for you, it's actually better for them. But they do it by destroying crops and destroying people. So it gives the example of Bengal that has been basically destroyed by the East Indian Company for the sake of higher profits. Bengal, Smith says, is a very fertile country, and yet hundreds of thousands of people die of starvation each year, thanks to the policies of the East Indian Company. So when Smith says that blood and treasure has been used to enrich the merchants at the expense of others, he really means it. In addition, by having monopolistic policies that limit competition, merchants and manufacturers are able to increase prices in the domestic market as well. Higher prices are going to affect the most the poor people. And Smith tells us the poor are the most vulnerable people in society, and they will be negatively affected by higher prices. Again, this is not a question of I can't afford something, a luxury. It's a question of will I be able to survive? Smith gives the example of a woman in the Highlands of Scotland which bears 20 children in her life, and only 2 of them are able to survive to adulthood. Poverty causes death, and high prices causes poverty. So the merchants are responsible not only for the death through war, but also from the death for lack of economic growth. So I would like to suggest that the caricature that Smith has often attached to itself as greed is good is not part of Smith's account. Greed is not good. Greed is violently condemned by Smith. The mean rapacity of the monopolist, and mean rapacity are Smith's word, is aggressively attacked by Smith, because the way in which I suggest reading it is that the wealth and justice have to grow hand in hand. A nation can grow wealthy only if its growth is accompanied by justice and not by injustices. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Robbie, and for the invitation to come, and in particular, thank you, Roger, too, for all the great work that's been going on throughout the Tercentenary year to mark the Kirkcaldy and Scotland, one of Scotland's most famous sons, and it's a great pleasure to be part of the Tercentenary commemorative events, both here in Kirkcaldy and in Glasgow, too. It's a really enjoyable conversation so far, and I should disclose, for someone who's leading the commemorative events at the University of Glasgow, I am not a Smith scholar. I did have the privilege of spending 3 weeks in my time as a student at the University of Glasgow learning from the late, great Andrew Skinner, who was a fantastic scholar of Smith. And I would hope that he's looking down on us this week and thinking that we're doing a good job to commemorate the great man's life. And I think we are making progress. I've got to leave quite quickly after the event today to go back to an event that our students are running at the University of Glasgow. And we have over 300 students who have proactively come together to run their own event and their own activities marking the legacy of Adam Smith. And it's that legacy and it's how Smith is used and referred to that I want to talk on a bit in my remarks here. And we've heard already from a couple of speakers about the academic debate that's particularly gained traction in recent years about the almost a revisionist view of Smith, or actually trying to encourage people not just to think about Adam Smith as the author of The Wealth of Nations and the home founder of the Chicago School, but also the theory of moral sentiments and that broader view of Smith. And he's increasingly used by academics, both on the left and the right, for arguments. So sometimes academics making the case for small government, free trade, limited regulation, but also looking at the role of government in able to provide support for public services, increasing education, infrastructure, and the creation of social welfare. And it's quite interesting just to see how it's ebbed and flowed over the years. So there was the famous conference held here in Scotland in 1976, which was at the height of the Chicago School, where George Stigler gave the famous quote about Adam Smith was alive and well and living in Chicago. But also, if you go back to 1926, the 150th anniversary of the Wealth of Nations, Chicago School were running lots of activities at the time, but it was quite a different view of Smith. It was much more the social Smith and much more the inclusive Smith in that context. And again, as we were hearing there from Robbie, I think one of the things that we're really keen to do is to use all the great work that's been going on in Kirkcaldy, Panmure and Glasgow for the Tercentenary to think about how we can build momentum to 250th anniversary of the Wealth of Nations in 3 years' time. One of the things that I wanted to do is to pick up on some of the points that that has been made by Bob already about how economists view Adam Smith and how economists have used Adam Smith in many ways in invoking their own ideas and their own thoughts before turning to actually how do politicians use Adam Smith, or how do politicians perhaps not use Adam Smith in perhaps the way that he would like. Don't worry, Roger, I can see you shuffling nervously there, but I mean other politicians. And this is quite an interesting survey. So we worked with Chicago Booth, so the home of Chicago economics, to do a couple of surveys where they run a quarterly survey of leading economists throughout the world. And they ask them questions. Typically, it's about day-to-day, what's happening in day-to-day economy. So they'll ask them questions about, do you think interest rates are going to go up? Do you think the economy is going to grow? Do you think investment is going to go up? But we got them very kindly to add in a couple of questions to mark the Tercentenary. And the first question is quite interesting. So they asked all these economists around the world. The question was, Adam Smith's metaphor of the visible hand has been foundational to the development of modern economic theory. And you see the results there. So 49% strongly agree, 39% agree, and very few disagree. And again, that just, in many ways, just shows you the scale and impact of Adam Smith. Now, Bob's quite right in that a lot of economists use the invisible hand as in an argument to make particular claims around regulation, about public policy, about a certain type of economics. So we can move to the next slide. We'll see, we asked that question, is Adam Smith's metaphor of the invisible hand, has it been commonly misinterpreted as advocacy for pure laissez-faire capitalism? And what's quite interesting is that you get the same type of result. So actually, in contrast to picking up Bob's thing, is that economists are in many ways are quite conscious now about the accusation of using the invisible hand and arguing that that's purely the argument that Adam Smith was using. That in some ways that's not the right argument, but in many ways economists are now trying to defend themselves. They go, no, we're not saying that. Actually, we mean something else. So we're really keen to explore this and and explore exactly, well, what do economists just mean if it's not invoked in this way? And is this an actual substantive change, or is it something which is more than conscious that they need to at least answer the question that clearly, oh no, the invisible hand is something much broader than that, or economics is something much broader than that. So it's really interesting how the economics profession interprets Adam Smith, really interesting how the economics profession uses Adam Smith and his ideas in the academic writings. But what I want to do is look at the policy process. So that got us thinking about, well, if economists are slightly unsure or changing their minds about Adam Smith and how they potentially use, at least publicly, they use the arguments around Adam Smith, what happens to the various policy debates and in politics, and how is Adam Smith used, referred to in that context? So what we did, if you maybe move to the next slide, which is a bit busy, but hopefully gives you the idea of what we've done. So there's something called Hansard. So for people who don't know what Hansard is, Hansard is essentially the public record of political debates in the House of Commons and the House of Lords. We look at the House of Commons. And it's essentially the record of MPs speaking in the chamber about policy questions or Prime Minister's questions or questions to the Chancellor of the Budget and the like. And it's possible now with modern techniques to scrape the record of Hansard. So essentially to go back through every record of Hansard and to find when Adam Smith is mentioned, or to find a point where Adam Smith's key ideas are mentioned, and you can get the record and you can find it immediately about when Adam Smith is referred to and used. And it's quite interesting because there was quite a lot of work done historically about how Adam Smith had been used and influenced debate in the House of Commons shortly after his death, and actually when he was around. There's a really lots of work that's gone into about how influential Smith was at the time, but very little looking at actually what has happened to Smith since. And I guess the interesting question that we're interested in is Smith used ornamentally? So is he just someone that's held up as being, back to Bob's point, the visible hand, so therefore justifies X policy, or is there actually genuine engagement and discussion with Adam Smith's ideas? And that might give us, our answer might give us a certain view of our politicians and how Smith is used. So just some results I wanted just to talk you through. Some of them are quite interesting and quite funny in many ways. So since 1919, Adam Smith or his ideas, so invisible hand, the key quotes that Adam Smith has used has been referenced 780 times in Hansard, 780 separate occasions since 1919 to 2019. So quite a lot. So clearly Adam Smith is an influential figure in policy debates. So what's quite interesting is that if you look at it, is what he's actually referenced to in various different elements. He, as you might think, he's referencing debates on trade, unsurprisingly. He's referenced on debates on regulation of industries. He's referencing debates over nuclear power, telecoms, debates over the common market. He's also referenced in a debate over subsidy support for Latin American film markets, which is a slightly bizarre one. But in general, he's used in that context of economic regulation and economic development. What's quite interesting, if you look at all the various elements here, the orange line is actually just a reference to Adam Smith. So what's quite interesting in the Hansard is the number of times that Adam Smith is just used in a debate. And what's quite interesting when you look at it is, oh, Adam Smith would agree with me, or Adam Smith would disagree with you. And what's quite interesting is just how many times that's where the conversation stops, or that's where it ends. And I'll give you two good examples of that in a second. We can look at it about the context about when he's referenced. Interesting, Smith is referred to in a positive light. It's quite difficult to find any member of Parliament talking about Adam Smith being critical. Most of the time it's used in a positive way, either to support a policy position or to reference Smith as being someone who's positive. 4 or 5 quotes tend to get used a lot. Invisible hand, as you'll see. Which one's that? The green line, you can see that's quite popular. That one gets used quite a lot. So these ones, theorem moral sentiments, much less. Wealth of nations, quite popular as well. You can see the pink line that moves up. So the same type of references get used relatively regularly throughout the period. Interesting, there's not much difference between Conservatives and Labour in the use of Adam Smith. Conservatives mention the wealth of nations slightly more than the Labour, but only just. Scottish MPs use Smith much more, so as you'd expect, one of us was like us and all that, so he gets used a lot. But what the most fascinating thing, I think, and the bit that just to conclude on, is that it's amazing just how ornamental Smith is used in the policy debates, which I think is, if we're thinking about building on this legacy and looking forward to actually recapturing Smith and using Smith to try and get people to engage with the ideas and not just simply refer to Adam Smith in passing. And I see Michelle Thompson, MSP here, who led a fantastic debate in Parliament this week, which they had to extend. They weren't able to get MSPs, every MSP to speak, and actually really substantively engaging in Adam Smith, and I make no comment about the difference between the Scottish Parliament and the House of Commons in that ability to have a substantive debate on Adam Smith. But one of the things that's quite interesting for me is that how can we actually get the debate around Smith to be much more substantial into the policy debate and conversations, and to use the ideas of Smith to actually inform things. I'll give you two examples of where Smith has been used in debates by MPs. Two former chancellors, so one not that far from here, and a good example, he talks about the Britain that has constantly championed toleration, liberty and social responsibility before any country in Europe, and that for both since the days of Adam Smith invented the idea of civic society and mutual obligation. So there's a real substantive quote about drawing on the key ideas of Adam Smith and to use to help inform the arguments that's being made. So that's one example of a chancellor using Adam Smith. I'll give you an example of another chancellor. Didn't last as long. In fact, lasted a very short time. Very recent chancellor, lasted a very short time. It says, Adam Smith made it very clear in The Wealth of Nations, a book that many honourable members will know, how societies grow rich and how they can become very poor. I'm sorry to say that the past 13 years have been an exercise that Adam Smith and his University of Edinburgh would have probably awarded a flat D grade for performance, although perhaps they awarded a B grade for effort. Now, there's two things with that. Clearly, it's a passing reference. There's no substantial there. It's just there. Adam Smith talks about the economy. Therefore, you should agree with me. And secondly, of course, he went to the University of Glasgow and not the University of Edinburgh. So I hope that the birthday that we've got this year provides us a chance not just to recapture Smith or debate Smith and look at the broad depth of Smith the scholar and academic community, but also for us to help push forward the discussion of Adam Smith's ideas and his values in policy debates as well. And I really hope we can maybe pick up some of these ideas in the discussion that we're going to have. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you this morning. Thank you.
I'm not going to come to the lectern because I'd quite like to be able to see both the speakers and the audience. I thought that all the conversations were extremely interesting, and I'm sure that, well, there are certainly plenty of questions I can ask. I don't think that's the purpose of it. I'm not here to interview you all, but I'd rather like to turn to the audience and see what questions people have about what they've learned from Smith. And I see two questions at the front here. Councillor first.
So my question is for Maria, Professor Maria Paganelli. I hope I said that correctly. You hear me? Is it working? Yes, you're talking about the importance of growth when you were talking about that woman who'd had 20 children and 2 had survived. But don't you think, is it on? It's not. Hello, hello, no. Okay, so I'll speak a little bit louder. Do you think that really we need to learn to more, and it's not about growth? Because obviously we live in we have finite resources, and it's about learning to share more than growth to make sure that people are well. That's my question.
You're very welcome. But
So I answer directly? Okay. Thanks. That is a very, very good question. Smith sees the problem of poverty as absolute poverty. So the problem is that if you don't have anything to share, you can't share. So in order to be able to share, you have to be productive. So you have to have something to share with. To share, so you have to be able to have enough to live and to allow others to live. And there are situations, Smith says, there are societies that are so miserably poor in which if you are not able to produce what you consume, you're going to die. And So he gives the example of societies where the children or infants, elderly, and people who are subjected by lingering diseases who have to be abandoned, to be devoured by wild beasts. Right? So there is nothing to share. And if you can't provide for yourself, you will have to be abandoned to be eaten by wild beasts or devoured by wild beasts. So I think that the two, before you're able to share, you have to be able to have something, to produce enough to support yourself and others. And his suggestion is that with the introduction of commerce, you are able to produce so much more that a lot of people who are unproductive, meaning that they're not able to produce and contribute, can yet be supported. So I think that the key is to see the productive aspect that allows you to be to support even people who can produce.
Oh, yes, you do. Sorry, right. Sorry, right. Sorry, I lack of clarity.
Completely agree. I'm fishing about from in my notes. I think this is a quote from Smith in the Theory of Moral Sentiments. This disposition to admire and almost to worship the rich and powerful, and to despise or at least to neglect persons of poor and mean condition, though necessary both to establish and to maintain the distinction of the ranks and order of society, is at the same time the great and most universal cause of the corruption of our moral sentiments. So I think it's clear to say that the 18th century Smith would be appalled at the allocation of wealth, the skewed allocation of wealth and income. And I think from that sort of basis, that sort of value basis, Smith would be very supportive, as Maria said, about, shall we say, a redistribution of income and wealth in that respect. I think it's a very powerful statement he makes.
Professor McCloskey.
These are all extremely interesting perspectives on the great man. But it seems to me that you miss the middle bits. We tend to think, without thinking very much, in a top-down fashion. The state or the boss or the general is telling us what to do. Or we think from an individual point of view, what I would do or how I act. And the invisible hand, as understood in the old Chicago school, of which I am a member, if you want to see a Chicago economist, here she is a narrow understanding of the consequences of this bottom-up. But I think Smith had I think it's characteristic, especially of the Scottish Enlightenment view of society, that it's not the macro or the micro, it's the meso, it's the middle interactions among humans. That's the big story. And in all four of you, I challenge you, I miss that. Smith's favorite example, which he used a lot, is language. The Scots language, which, by the way, is not just a consequence of London English, it's its own language, is a result of interaction among Anglo-Saxon speakers influenced by French in this neighborhood for 1,000 years. So what about that middle bit? not just the narrow, oh, if you're self-interested, crazy self-interested Ayn Rand style, then everything works out in the economy, but the other social middle bits, language, ethical attitudes, family, care, and so forth, which are in the middle interaction. They're neither the top nor the bottom.
Thank you very much. Does anyone want to start with that? I'm looking at you, Sheila. I think that you may have some interesting things to say on that.
I completely agree. I mean, that's such an important set of points that you've made at different levels, indeed. I mean, Smith thinks of the individual as a social being, which in a way sums up the importance of the relationship between individual and society, that people understand themselves with reference to society. Behavior is customary, beliefs are customary, challenged by reason and experience, of course. But I quite agree about the middle. And you've contributed so much on the concept of the importance of communication and language. I mean, this was very, very important for Smith, that this was one of the faculties. I mean, I just mentioned some of the faculties when I spoke, but one important faculty was communication, not least because we learn through persuasion, which requires communication, which requires some common language, which has a social foundation, basically.
Does anyone else want to comment?
Can I say that?
Of course you can.
I say that I agree with Sheila.
Okay.
I would go further. There is a perhaps this is my fault. I should have made it much clearer in my comments. But yes, I was attempting to appeal to, as you say, the meso, the level, the relationship between people. People are socially conditioned. They're socially embedded. Even in the Wealth of Nations, Smith talks about how we are mutually in need of one another. Not in terms of, so he talks about this interdependency, and I think Sheila's articulated it far better than I can. And indeed, I'd go further, and this is for those of you who are interested in the founder of a group called the Institutional Economists, Thorsten Veblen, talked about how institutions as rule systems are embedded within us through our habits of thought. That's in Smith as well. In the theory of moral sentiments, he talks about our habitual reflections of rules. And this is an anticipation, I think, of Veblen, and I'm afraid completely ignored by mainstream economists. And in fact, on that, I was very interested in what my good colleague Graeme was saying about the ornamental Smith. I think the biggest issue isn't that politicians make Smith an ornament, it's that economists have made Smith an ornament. And that's the tragedy for me. And it's corrupted, to be provocative, it's corrupted not just economic thinking, but the way that economics is taught, which is perhaps more important.
Right. Anyone else? Right. Johnson.
I've got a quote from J.K. Galbraith, and he said Smith was categorical about almost nothing. So I wondered if you would all agree, and if you don't, could you give us one thing that you think Smith was categorical on?
Yeah, I can think of several things straight away, but yes, please go ahead, Maria.
I think a comment is generally correct in the sense that is always qualifying most of his statements, where it's not non-categorical, where it is categorical, is on human homogeneity, meaning that we are all born the same. there are no innate differences among individuals. So there are no differences among any individuals, so regardless of where you are or what you do or where you come from, we are all born the same. He goes so radical by even saying that until the age of 6 or 8, a parent is not able to distinguish a child from another child, because we're all born the same. And until the age of 6 or 8 is because at 6 or 8 is when you start to work. So our differences emerge from our exposure to external stimuli, but not because we are innately different. So that is something that he does not relax anywhere in any of his works.
Does anyone else want to suggest where Smith was absolutely certain about something?
Can I?
Of course, yes.
I agree that with Maria that Smith is notable for qualifying everything and for being clear that so many arguments have to be specific to context. But the one that came to mind is a lovely comment on Descartes, where he starts off being quite praiseworthy of Descartes, and then he says that what he wrote in his theory of astronomy was it contained no word of truth and was one of the greatest romances that was ever wrote. Which was
I mean, building, and I think it's a great question, and one of the, I think part of the answer back to that is that Smith, and as I said, I'm not a Smith scholar, but understanding what the key points you can take away is actually there is no definitive answer to a simple question. One of the mistakes I think economists and policymakers do is read Smith for the answer, and actually Smith doesn't give you the answer, but he tells you about what you might need to think about in order to come up with the answer, and context is important, and complexity is there, and he does warn against speculative physicians giving you simple solutions to complex problems. And you could argue that's perhaps, as someone who's come in and out of the policy world, that's perhaps the best lesson we can take from Smith, and moving away from thinking there are simple solutions to really complex problems, whether that be tackling inequality, whether that be trade, whether that be globalization, that the world is complex and there are caveats with it, and it's the thought process that you have to go through to come to an outcome that will lead you to a better place.
There's several questions coming, so we'll start with John, and then back, and then over here. Oh, sorry, you've got it already.
Landed in my hand here. Yes, Ed Knoll, Westmont College. Both in the presentation on the MPs and the use of Smith, the reference to laissez-faire was made about invisible hand, and we've heard the misuse of Smith somehow being a laissez-faire advocate discussed in earlier presentations this week. Recognizing that, where Smith speaks about the need, for example, of a firewall to be built to prevent an externality that's negative and so forth on someone's house, where Smith speaks about the need to constrain interest rates from going too high because projectors will be borrowing money. It seems to me or even a program to where so to speak, this is a bit anachronistic, I guess, but to correct a market failure of not enough roads being built and that sort of thing, public goods. Smith seems to speak about correcting and dealing with these so-called market failures. What about a distinction, though, between that and a positive program for the state? And where in Smith can we find examples of that? He doesn't always speak categorically, I agree, but I'm not sure we find in him, that case for the state that sometimes people make of an industrial policy for income redistribution. Yes, he says that in some instances we tax certain goods a little more heavily for the rich and necessary, it's not for the poor. But I'm just wondering, where's the positive program for the state is over against simply correcting externalities? Can we make that distinction? What does the panel think about that?
Okay, so we're trying to understand Smith's view. If I take this correctly, Ed, you're thinking about where Smith thought intervention was possible to improve public policy. Yep. Does anyone want to take a lead in that?
I'll have a...
Of course, yes.
In a way, Smith would, perhaps, in that I'm not a Smith scholar. I would never make any claims to be an expert. I have some understanding, I think, of what I think Smith is trying to say, gleaned from Smith and various other sources. But I don't think Smith, my own perspective, it's Smith isn't advocating the state as a corrective, as in addressing market failures. Smith advocates the state, as I understand it, as a facilitator of the commercial society. So a successful commercial society is one that is harmonious. Yes, there are markets, obviously. It needs the state. The state is not a substitute for the market, to put it that way. The state facilitates is a necessity for the flourishing of a commercial society. So looking at it in that way, from my understanding, that would be the positive spin, as it were, from certainly my interpretation of Smith. And I'd be interested to see if anybody agreed with me.
Bob has rushed in and stuck his colours firmly to the mast. Does anyone else want to qualify or argue or agree with him as Bob did with Sheila?
It's a very difficult question now, because I don't think you could I don't think I can see, at least, a positive program for the government, unless you think of national defense as a positive program. But again, I'm not sure that would count, because the way in which I read Smith on national defense is, yes, it is a priority of the state to defend, right? But defense is a reaction to an attack. So I will still see it as I'm taking care of a problem, not I'm trying to build something positive. The other explicit function that the Smith gives to the state is infrastructure, but again, is always qualified. So is mostly financed through tolls, arranged at the local level. So those, maybe infrastructure is the closest thing I can think of, or like building roads and building canals. That could be a positive role, as opposed to trying to fix a problem.
Okay, Johnson. Yeah.
Thanks. Well, first of all, can I thank our four speakers for giving us amazing sidelights on the work of Smith. I just loved what you all had to say there, so thanks for that. For me, you've drawn out for me how the skill of Smith, he could turn a good phrase, and he could tell a very good story as well. And I guess it reminded me of the power of a good story to change people's minds and actually to change the world. And those of us who are fortunate enough to teach have a stock of, stories and sometimes jokes that we tell to change young minds. What stories from Smith should we be telling our students now?
Well, I guess we're all teachers, so I'm sure that, Bob, you're scribbling away already, I can see, but Does anyone have any favourite Smith stories? I mean, the obvious one is that when I went into my very first economics lecture, we got the pin factory, which is right at the start of Wealth of Nations. And I think that actually one of the things which we've been missing out today, because we've been thinking about Smith so broadly, we haven't really thought about the fact that Smith taught quite a lot of economics. And that you've got to get through the whole of, well, certainly the whole of book 1 of Wealth of Nations before you get into some of the kinds of interesting ideas that we're talking about today. So, yes. But I would also have to say, we got as far as the pin factory, and then the Wealth of Nations was closed. So, anyone else?
Which is the example of the finger in China. I think that is trying to put yourself in other people's shoes, trying to get perspective on your situation versus the lives of others, I think is really powerful. I should just say on the pin factory, we have an amazing artifact at Glasgow University, which is that Smith was for a time essentially bought the books for the library. And we have various encyclopedias, and we've got the key bits of where the pin factory is set out. Now, we can speculate, of course, and he's not here to dispute, so I can speculate that. We actually see the readings he was doing at the time and coming up with the idea of the pin factory. So get yourself down to Glasgow University to see that.
Well, indeed, when The Wealth of Nations was published, Adam Ferguson fell out with Smith because he thought he'd stolen Ferguson's example of the pin factory, but actually both of them, I think it was Dennis Diderot, who was the originator of the story. So yes, even then it was a story that was being passed around.
I'm sorry, because I can't quite see you with the volume in front. Another story, the Smith, I don't know if that's what you were asking, if Smith's stories, meaning the story the Smith tell us, or the story that we would use to tell Smith's account. But one story the Smith does tell us is how do we make a wooden coat? And it requires the cooperation of hundreds of people to make a wooden coat. From the people from shipbuilding to the waivers and the coloring. And so that's the very beginning of the Wealth of Nations, and is a short little story that I think is easily replicated in the sense that we have like the eye pencil story that is basically the same idea. Like, what does it take? Can you make a pencil out of scratch? And the answer is no, you can't. Nobody can. And similarly, he would say, can you make a code out of scratch? And no, you can't. You need the cooperation of everybody.
Anything else?
I've only got one.
I suppose that actually this, for teachers, is perhaps something to remember, that Smith did not enjoy his time at Oxford. And so there's actually quite a lot in Smith about how effectively the entire teaching staff at Oxford was completely useless. So there you are. There's a warning there. Now, I think you were wanting to ask a question.
This is probably heresy with a panel of economists, but to what extent would the collection of conferred community advantage through the collection of an annual ground rent plus the application of a universal basic income go towards meeting Smith's criteria of care?
I guess I have to come back to you, Bob, but you know, annual ground rents, well, land taxes were developed very much by economists in the 19th century as a possible way of funding. We're in the 19th century, but really it was the French physiocrats who argued for land taxes as the basis of simplifying. So Smith was certainly aware of the ideas at the time.
I think it's an excellent question, and like excellent question, I don't have the answer. I'm afraid. Of course, from what we're experiencing centuries. I think for time was actually very radical in terms of the role, the proactive, as it were, role for the state in society. Certainly for the time, at least as I understand it, it would be pure speculation in my part about Smith's, in other words, I don't know, but pure speculation in my part about Smith's attitude to such matters as a universal basic income. The point I would make, however, question is using Smith to frame the questions that are asked and therefore to inform the direction of the answer. And it takes much better minds than mine to not only frame the question, you've done it excellently, also to head towards an answer.
That's my
Okay, so you're trying to avoid answering the question, but I'll throw it open and see if anyone else. You've already nailed your colours to the mast once, so I think we'll let you off. Anyone else? Or does it? Are you looking at me to try and? I will very quickly say that in terms of what, and in fact, this comes back to some of what Maria was talking about the importance of poverty. I'm not really thinking about universal basic income here so much as work which has been done in development economics recently, which emphasizes very much the importance of people, giving people the skills and the ability and the capabilities so that they are able to move themselves out of situations of poverty. Now, in that context, universal basic income seems to me to be giving people sufficient of a guarantee that they can live a life which is interesting and creative and socially useful. But whether it is the best way and whether it should be financed by a particular form of taxation, I'm not going to try and get into the detail of that just now. Now, I saw a question here, and then I'll come to you, sir.
Hi, thank you. We've heard a lot this morning about the importance of care and thinking of others. I'm just wondering whether Smith said anything that would help us understand what might have motivated the merchants in terms of some of their behaviour, and indeed what might motivate some bad behaviour today. Yes, what might motivate the behaviour of merchants in the context of apparently us being motivated by care.
Okay, so. So can I just ask, I'm not seeing anyone jumping in, can I just ask just for a little bit of clarification, when you say merchants, are you thinking about the provision of care through a market system, or are you thinking of, yes?
And given the immersion, I can handle it a little bit. Merchants are no different than anybody else. So we all act the same in the same circumstances. We all want to have the approbation of others. And the way in which we can achieve approbation is done usually in two ways, through virtue or through wealth. The problem with virtue is that it's very difficult to detect. So it's very difficult that you see somebody who's virtuous, but it's much easier to recognize wealth because it shines, Smith says. And so sometimes we are tempted into achieving more wealth, even through means that are not appropriate, because by showing off more wealth, people will admire us. And they will, the more wealth you are able to show off, the more people admire you, and the more it's likely that people will forget or ignore the means through which you achieve your wealth. So you are tempted by big profits because by winning a lot, you increase your status enough that people will not look at how you actually got your wealth. If you are able to achieve that profit, that extra wealth for yourself, anybody would do it. The merchants are in a better position to do it than anybody else, simply because of what they do. And because they are able to, they understand their interest and they're able to pursue it. People who live by wage for them it's more difficult to understand their interests just because they're so busy in trying to survive. The nobles or the aristocrats are too interested in achieving their ornaments, Smith says, than actually pursuing what would be their interest. The merchants are the only one that they understand their interest very well and are able to pursue it. And the problem with them is that that goes against the interest of society because of the increase in profit. There's an increase in price and decrease in competition. But anybody in their position would act exactly the same. So there is nothing particular about the nature of the merchants, it's just the incentives that they're faced. They're able to convince the legislator to give them privileges so that they can increase their profit.
Anyone else want to jump in straight away? I mean, one of the things, by the way, to come back to one of the previous questions, things which Smith opposed, I think Smith was very strongly opposed to whenever he found evidence of the abuse of economic power, or indeed the accumulation of economic power, because the accumulation of a power, as Maria has suggested, almost certainly would lead to its abuse. So I think that there's a very strong element of that in how you would end up in situations of injustice. And that in turn, perhaps, to come back to the question of the positive program for the state is to clear the way for economic competition. That's just a very quick attempt to summarize things. I mean, does anyone else want to comment on Bob?
What Maria was saying, but also the celebration that Smith, amongst other, such as Keynes, found rather distasteful. But another way is Smith was one of the earliest advocates of corporate social responsibility.
And, oh yes, there's a question here. And then I see one and two, yeah, I see another couple of questions after that. So down here at the front, please. Perhaps just quickly say that, I could turn this into, well, we've had universal basic income, which if you go to Chicago, that's just negative income tax. And in the same way, what Bob has just been talking about is straightforward Friedmanite economics. So we can unite Smith and Chicago very easily. Sorry.
I just wondered, what is it about Adam Smith that is particularly original? What was it that caught the attention of his contemporaries and made The Wealth of Nations in particular such a smash hit?
Was it a smash hit, I suppose? And what was it, in this 1,000 pages, what was original?
One of the main attractions of The Wealth of Nations was his position on the empire. Smith's position on the British Empire was published in March 1776. His views on the colonies were quite radical. He suggested that the colonies were a disaster for Britain and they should get rid of it. So his idea was let the colony go because they are not worth having. If you are not willing to let them go, and you're not, then incorporate them. Unite them with Britain so that the people in the colonies will have the right to vote and you'll have the right to tax. So just like England and Scotland created a union, he wanted all the colonies to be part of the union. And the third alternative that he saw was war. They will ask for independence and will fight for it and will win. So I think that his position on the empire and the colonies was what attracted a lot of attention.
And just to emphasize how prescient that was, only 14 weeks after Wealth of Nations was published, we have the American Declaration of Independence. Right. Sheila, you were wanting to come in.
Yeah, I mean, in addition to the content of the Wealth of Nations, I think what really attracted people's attention was the way in which Smith approached the question of the nature and causes of the Wealth of Nations, and that was to present a system. Rather than a set of isolated ideas, he presented a way of thinking about socioeconomic relations as a whole, how the different aspects of the economy interacted with government and so on. And it wasn't just that, but in terms of what attracted attention, but also, as was discussed earlier, he was a great storyteller. And not just accounts of incidents. He was a great persuader. I mean, he wrote himself about the use of rhetoric and gave some advice about what good rhetoric consisted of. So he was very aware of what he was doing. He was trying to persuade people that his way of thinking about the economy was a good way. He knew he couldn't prove any of it absolutely, because of the nature of the world. But he set out to persuade, and he did a good job of it.
Just adding to Sheila's point, what I think is quite fascinating about reading The Wealth of Nations or Theory of Moral Sentiments, and if anybody hasn't done it or hasn't done it for a while, go back and look at it. There are bits of it which are very dry and snooze fest, but the stories like the Pin Factory and like the China example, they're remarkably readable. And it's amazing to think that this was somebody writing, 250 years ago, over 250 years ago, in a way which is actually still accessible today. And it brings it alive. You can actually visualize the thought process that goes in there. And I think that's the bit that's one of the most powerful things. It's quite interesting, again, is one of the things that we've been doing for the Tercentenary. We've just completed a national competition to get students to redesign the front cover of The Wealth of Nations. And it's quite remarkable the visual examples that people have come up with, the Pin Factory, linking the story of the economy to things like climate change and what is a wealthy nation in 2023 versus what was a wealthy nation in 1776. Thinking about the artificial hand rather than the invisible hand. So what is the invisible hand in a world of AI? And it is quite striking, again, come back to your point about what I think is at the time that Smith was doing. Yes, there's lots of these ideas were out there, but pulling them together in a system, in a narrative that has stood the test of time for over 250 years, I think is perhaps one of the most remarkable achievements.
You don't have to, Bob. Right. Hey, yeah, we'll take the next question.
Cheers. Thanks very much indeed. It's a fascinating panel. This is by way of observation, a slightly underbaked question, but it struck me as I was listening to it that part of the problem that we have with dealing with Adam Smith is that Adam Smith doesn't help his own cause. The reason we misunderstand him may be partly because of the way he constructed his work, by which I mean that he offers us an inquiry into the nature and origins of the wealth of nations, but he doesn't tell us anything about the purpose of wealth. And one of the things that struck me listening to the panel is that the purpose of wealth may well then be construed as the ability. If you're absolutely poor, you can't exercise care, you can't exercise moral charity, tolerance, decency. And wealth provides you with a capacity, the tools to do that kind of moral work. So in fact, what you get is a sort of flip side version of Smith. the Wealth of Nations gives you an inquiry into its origins and its nature, but it's the theory of moral sentiment that might produce the purpose of wealth, the exercise of care and the exercise of charity. And that begs the question. I was struck listening to the to the first paper about the ways in which, in many ways, economists have yet to move past a self-interested version of Smith. They keep saying, well, it's a kind of self-interest that drives them forward. And I guess the question in my mind is, what might an altruistic version of the political economy of Smith look like?
It's a fairly large one. Question to ask, a very interesting way of putting it. Sheila, can I ask you to, since you were sort of referenced, to start off the discussion?
Gosh, the great questions coming from the audience. Gosh, what would an altruistic... I mean, altruism was inherent to Smith's theory of moral sentiments. In the self-interest didn't mean selfishness for him. And behavior is always other regarding. I mean, one might end up behaving somewhat selfishly, but in the sense that you want to have the approval of others. But it does condition behavior. So, I mean, putting it that way isn't as far as altruism. I'm not sure how you could construct a view of society as completely altruistic. Sorry? Oh, that allow it in. Well, it's there. It's there, and it's regarded within mainstream economics as an aberration. That's a problem for economics. But it's, I mean, as far as Adam Smith is concerned, and those who follow his way of thinking, it is part and parcel of human behavior. But I mean, it is a huge issue for those of us who take that view to deal with the fact that mainstream economics has such difficulty in incorporating altruism.
Right. You want to go ahead, right? Okay. Yes.
I think it's an excellent question, and thank you very much. Again, I agree with Sheila. It's that Nick Clegg moment in it. 20. I think this is where perhaps mystic have and Smith was optimistic in that it's not so much altruism. I think Sheila's right about the other regarding. Obviously, it's more about harmony. It's a harmonious society. It's a society at ease with itself. Therefore, it's suffused with values that would tend to enable human flourishing, because there is a strong, at least as I understand it, a strong Aristotelian Smith talked about commercial society, became known as capitalism. That, for Smith, was essentially the final stage of human development. We'd be talking not about scarcity, we'd be talking about abundance. People would be much wealthier, much more at ease with themselves. Whereas Marx obviously witnessed this perhaps unfolding in a rather different way than Smith envisaged, but nonetheless viewed human progress in essentially the same way as Smith is inherently optimistic, that the harmonious state would be something else, but we had to go through this capitalist society. I think the problem, and it's just to pick up Sheila's point, I think the problem with mainstream economics is it's interpreted harmony as equilibrium, and it's tried to fashion this notion of mechanistic equilibrium onto Smith's much more overarching terminology, at least as I understand.
I don't know if that answers your question.
I think, like Smith, we're not answering questions.
Okay,
We're just giving possibilities.
I think it's a very difficult question, actually, because for me to be able to answer it, I need to have a good definition of altruism. And because altruism can mean a lot of different things. And if altruism is other regarding behavior, then it's very easy to answer. If altruism is generosity, that is also relatively easy to answer. But if altruism is seen as I only care about others and I don't care about myself, so as a substitute to self-interest as opposed to a complement to in personal interest, then it becomes a problem, because I don't think that it is possible to, for Smith at least, to even conceive a society that is based on individuals that are exclusively altruistic. Just like it's not possible for him to think of a society in which individuals are exclusively self-interested. We are complex beings with a lot of different aspects in us. And so altruism as I care about others is part of me, just like I care about myself. And you can't quite separate one from the other. It will come as a bundle. And when you separate them and you say, I'm going to have only self-interested individuals, then you fall into the trap of some economic theories. But if you also say, I don't want to have any self-interested part, and I only want to have the altruistic aspect, then you fall into a utopic environment. And I think Smith wants to avoid those extremes and instead presents a human being that is as a combination and in a sense a harmony of sentiments. And some may emerge more strongly than others, but they're still a bundle.
Okay, I think we've got time for, in fact, I'll take a question just from the back there. I'm not sure we'll have time for your question, William, but...
Hi there, thank you very much from the panel. I think we find a lot of times in Smith that he is addressed or referenced in vignettes, whether they be from The Wealth of Nations or from the Theory of Moral Sentiments. I think indeed the corpus of Smith tends to be discussed either as the Theory of Moral Sentiments or The Wealth of Nations or a vignette from one of those two. I was wondering if the panel would like to talk about any of the themes that unite the entirety of Smith's corpus, so that we can think of his ideas as a continuum rather than as a small aspect or takeaway. Thank you.
Okay, so try to summarize Smith. I'm sure that, well, I certainly know that when I teach on Smith, that I say, I'll just start with a few introductory remarks, and 2.5 hours later, students are battering, trying to get out of the classroom while I'm just talking onward. So anyone want to do it more briefly?
Could I just take a stab at this? The others, I'm sure, will have better answers. But in a way, it's, I would say what unites Smith's work is an approach to knowledge within the world that we live, where it's challenging to gather knowledge. And so we have his essay on the history of astronomy, where he talks about how scientists try and gather knowledge. We have his lectures on rhetoric, where he talks about how scientists try and persuade each other. We have the lectures on jurisprudence, where he elaborates on all sorts of things that are also in The Wealth of Nations and the Theory of Moral Sentiments, about how societies evolve and the role of law. And I mean, there's a whole range of essays that he wrote on different aspects, but I think what unites them is that he was focused on how can we know about the way in which the world works. And he just looked at different aspects of that in different pieces of work.
So I think one of the things there is that, you know, to think of Smith's youthful ambition, which was to develop a complete science of man, where man obviously includes women as well, but they didn't get much didn't appear very often in his writing. Anyone else?
So he worked on both books contemporaneously, right? So he published The Theory of Moral Sentiment first and then The Wealth of Nations, but he kept working on both. There's many editions until basically the day he died. So to see them as separate in a sense is a little bit difficult on the historical base because of he revised one, he revised the other, he revised one, he revised the other. That said, I think building on Sheila's point, there is a quest of understanding of human actions, of what makes, how we behave in a scientific way. And so there's a quest to identify what is constant in humans and what instead can change. And so you find a core that is typical of human beings, and then the contingency that can change the behavior. So you change the constraints and you will see the behavior change, not necessarily changing that core that makes a human human. So I think what is working with in both books is the understanding of what makes a core and what the understanding of what changes the constraints and the behavior that are affected by the constraints as opposed to the behavior that are instead part of our core, human core.
I completely agree. I think the question's an excellent one, and it points to a criticism that's been made to Smith going way back to 19th century, and indeed has been advanced more recently by Duncan Foley in his book, I think it's Adam's Folly, where the economy and the theory of moral sentiments is about society. So you get a rather separate spheres interpretation of Smith's work. Thereafter, they talk about the tensions that arise within. And I think that's just a function of perhaps what Sheila was saying about trying to interrogate this sense of human behavior in different aspects of life. More recently, at least as I understand it, Smith's scholarship is that the Wealth of Nations and the Theory of Moral Sentiments should be seen as complements. It's far more nuanced. So to take the example of Smith's notion of self-love, here, as I think we started off, and it's a nice round way to wrap things up, going back to the beginning, we started off, or at least Sheila started off by saying that people interact with one another and that necessarily involves values. And Smith tried to capture that with the notion of self-love. It's not just about selfishness, about being self-centered. It's also being self-approving. In other words, can I live with myself in terms of what I have done? And is it a legitimate decision in the context of cultural norms? And I think that's that sort of nuance is a unifying, or at least one of the unifying themes between theory of moral sentiments and the Wealth of Nations, at least for me.
Well, I will try and answer that last question, if I may, very briefly. before I wrap up completely and thank our panelists. Something which has occurred to me as I've been preparing for this event and other events this week is that Smith is very like the Roman god Janus. He looks both ways. He looks backwards into history, and much of what Maria was talking about, as she was speaking, I was thinking about how much of this you could find in the work of scholastic theologians, and indeed all the way up until the School of Salamanca. So Smith is very well aware of the tradition of virtue ethics, and that's one of the things which Professor McCloskey has emphasized we have to be aware of when we're reading Smith. The second thing which occurs to me, of course, is that he's looking back into history because his way of demonstrating what is happening in the economy is to develop a historical account. And that is Smith's way of determining what the truth was. Now, talking with people, yes, it was Sir Angus Deaton yesterday in his lecture at Glasgow who pointed out that the numbers in Smith, when you actually use the modern methods of economic history, Smith was very good at using numerical data to make the points which he wanted to. But the third thing that I want to mention, and I said Smith wrote almost exactly at the time of the American Revolution. The other thing which I would point out is that 3 years after Smith published Wealth of Nations, James Watt patented the separate condenser. And the spinning jenny was also patented the same year. So 1779 is sometimes called by economic historians the year of miracles. The year in which the economy started to change. And Smith, through all those stories, all that close observation, was able to say not only what was happening at that time, but he was able, in effect, to look into the future and say, this is how the economy is going to change. And that is why I think economists should be very interested in what Smith had to say. Now, yesterday at Glasgow University, I had a fascinating conversation with a political scientist who pointed out that in politics, it is still perfectly natural to go back to the work of Adam Smith and to spend an entire semester going through something like Moral Sentiments and Wealth of Nations so that students understand all the content. In the last 50 years, there has been a movement within economics which has essentially said, we don't need to know what's gone on before. In fact, nothing really happened before Samuelson wrote the Foundations in 1947. So what I would particularly like to thank our contributors for today is for the care with which they have gone back and read Smith and found material which is just as important as it is, just as important today as it was when Smith was writing it. To demonstrate that Smith is not simply a political economist, but indeed that Smith is truly an economist, an expert on the economy, which we should understand in terms of virtue, but indeed in terms of care, thinking particularly about thinking as well about the limitations that Sheila pointed to us, which come from our cognitive capacity, very much also thinking about Smith's concern that economic power could so easily be exploited. So I hope you will join me in thanking all of our contributors for what I think has been a very stimulating and excellent way to prepare for lunch.
Thank you very much, and I would like to thank in particular those in the audience who asked such penetrating and difficult questions for our panelists, who have certainly earned the large fee they're not getting. I was intrigued also by the questioning that mentioned the Scots language and communication that was central to the development at the time and of Smith. And so this afternoon, I wanted to make sure that we ended the session looking more broadly, looking beyond the written work of moral sentiment, looking beyond the written work of the Wealth of Nations, and trying to get a little sense of this man who had his own passions, who had his own engagement in society, and what was that about. So this afternoon, we are going to have one academic giving an opening lecture, which I'm so looking forward to. And then we are going to have some opera and we're going to have some Scots songs that we know Smith was interested and fascinated in. He actually wrote an essay which included a discussion of the role of music in society, and of dance, and of poetry, and the like. We know that he bought copies of the works of Robert Burns, as well as reading some of the academic texts that have been mentioned over the last 2 days. So this afternoon, we're going to try and capture a little more the sense of the man and how he interacted with his society at the time in Fife, the Scottish society. And so hopefully you'll come along and enjoy that. But I would like to have another thanks to all those who have come along today to answer such good questions. Thank you all.